He walked through the streets with his chest out and his chin high, the badge on his uniform shining under the sunlight. People moved aside when they saw him coming, some with respect, others with fear. To him, both felt the same. In his mind, the badge on his chest was more than metal. It was a shield that made him untouchable. He had spent years telling himself that this little symbol of authority placed him above everyone else. At first, when he was young in the force, he believed the badge was about service, about keeping order and protecting people. But as time passed, the respect it brought began to feed his pride. He noticed how people lowered their eyes when he questioned them, how their voices shook when he stood too close, how they rarely dared to argue. Slowly, the idea of serving others disappeared, and the idea of controlling them took its place. The town he lived in was not large. Everyone knew each other, and everyone knew him. Parents would whisper to their children, "Don't argue with him. Just do what he says." Business owners smiled nervously whenever he walked in, even if he wasn't buying anything. Some citizens admired his confidence, but most simply wanted to stay out of his way. He liked it that way. Fear was as good as respect may be, even better. Everywhere he went, he carried himself with arrogance. At the coffee shop, he skipped a line, and no one dared to complain. On the roads, he drove however he liked, parking wherever he pleased. If someone raised a question, he flashed the badge, and that was the end of it. For him, the badge was not just identification. It was a weapon. The people around him started to notice his change. They saw how he enjoyed the way waiters rushed to serve him first, how store clerks offered free items just to stay on his good side, how even local officials hesitated to disagree with him. The badge was meant to represent law and justice, but in his hands it had become a mask for pride. And yet, no one stood against him. Because everyone believed what he believed, that the badge made him invincible. He became more daring with time. If a man argued with him, he threatened to lock him up. If a woman complained about unfair treatment, he raised his voice and accused her of lying. He thought of himself as the king of the town, walking the streets like they belonged to him. Even when whispers of his behavior spread, he ignored them. They can talk all they want, he thought. At the end of the day, I have the badge, and they have nothing. There was something dangerous in the way he carried himself. It wasn't just arrogance. It was certainty. He believed rules were for others, not for him. He believed courts, judges, and laws could never touch him because his badge gave him immunity. People in the town looked at him and felt helpless. If they complained, who would listen? If they tried to fight, who would defend them? He was the law, or at least that's how he saw it. But power built on fear is fragile. Deep down, even though no one said it aloud, there was tension in the air. People carried their resentment silently, hiding it behind forced smiles. They told each other stories in hushed voices about the things he had done, but never dared to say it to his face. They were waiting for something or someone brave enough to challenge him, and he, blind in his pride, never noticed. He was too busy polishing his badge, enjoying the illusion that it made him untouchable. He didn't see that his arrogance was creating cracks in his armor, cracks that would widen the moment he chose the wrong target. He thought he was safe because no one had ever dared to fight back. He thought his power would last forever. He thought his badge was a crown that no one could take away. What he didn't know was that all it would take was one person, one woman with courage, to stand in a courtroom and prove him wrong. The day was coming when his badge would no longer shine as a symbol of power, but as a reminder of his downfall. For now, though he walked proudly through the streets, head high, enjoying the silence of those too afraid to speak, he was still convinced that his badge made him invincible. And that belief was the very thing that would destroy him. Asterisk, as months turned into years. The badge on his chest became less about duty and more about dominance. What began as small acts of arrogance, skipping lines, raising his voice, demanding special treatments, lowly turned into open abuse of power. He no longer even pretended to serve the people. Instead, he expected them to serve him. When he pulled someone over on the road, he didn't do it to enforce traffic laws. He did it to remind them who held the authority. Sometimes he let them go with a smirk. Sometimes he gave a fine, even when they had done nothing wrong. To him, the rules didn't matter. What mattered was the fear in their eyes, the way their voices shook when they tried to explain. He enjoyed that fear. It fed his ego like fuel to a fire. At the market, vendors gave him extra items without charge. Not because they wanted to, but because they feared what would happen if they didn't. He would stroll through stalls, pick what he liked, and walk away without paying, tossing a careless, "Put it on my account." There was no account. They all knew it. But no one dared to argue. Business owners felt the same pressure. A restaurant owner once complained quietly to a friend, "He eats for free every week, and if I say no, he'll find a reason to shut me down." The friend only shook his head. Everyone had the same fear cross him, and you risk losing everything. Women in the town avoided his path. They knew his temper, his sharp tongue, and his way of using intimidation to silence them. If a woman argued with him in public, he would shout louder, accuse her of disrespect, even threaten to arrest her on false charges. He thought his uniform made him above consequence, and for a long time, it seemed he was right. The townspeople whispered, but only in private. They shared stories of his arrogance, how he humiliated a young man by handcuffing him in front of his family for no real reason, how he shouted at an old woman until she cried, just because she asked why he parked his car in a disabled spot. Each story spread like smoke, but no one dared to speak openly. Fear was stronger than anger. In meetings with his colleagues, he acted the same way. Younger officers looked at him with unease, but none of them challenged him. He made sure they understood. Siding with him meant protection. Standing against him meant ruin. He played politics within the force, silencing anyone who questioned his methods. To him, the badge was not just a symbol of lot, was a weapon he used against both the innocent and his peers. What made it worse was how he believed his own lies. He convinced himself that everything he did was justified. "If they fear me, they will obey," he told himself. "And if they obey, the town is under control." To him, control was the same as justice, but the truth was different. His arrogance was rotting the foundation of trust between the people and the uniform he wore. The badge, once respected, became something people feared. Children whispered that if you misbehave, the officer will come for you. Parents no longer saw him as protection. They saw him as a threat. Still, no one acted against him. He had too much influence, too much intimidation. People thought, even if we complain, who will believe us? He has the badge. We have nothing, but deep inside the crowd of silent citizens, resentment grew. His unchecked behavior planted seeds of anger. People began to wait not openly, but silently for someone brave enough to confront him. Someone who would not be silenced by his shouting. Someone who would not tremble at his badge, and he, blinded by pride, didn't see it coming. He thought the silence of the people meant he had won. He thought fear was the same as respect. He thought he had finally built a wall around himself that no one could break. What he didn't know was that every abuse, every insult, every misuse of power was building toward a moment he could not avoid. A moment when he would cross paths with the wrong woman, the one person who would refuse to bow down. And when that day came, the badge he worshipped would no longer protect him. It would become the very weight that dragged him down. It happened on an ordinary morning. The kind of day where he expected everything to go his way, as it usually did. He walked into a small cafe, his badge gleaming on his chest, his steps heavy with pride. The place was filled with the smell of fresh bread and coffee, and people lowered their voices the moment he entered. That was normal. He liked that silence, the way rooms changed just because he appeared. He sat down at a table, waved at the waiter without even looking at the menu, and demanded, "Bring me the usual." The waiter nodded quickly, rushing to serve him. Everyone knew better than to delay his order. He leaned back, enjoying the power he thought he owned, until the door opened and she walked in. She wasn't dressed in anything fancy, just a plain blouse, jeans, and a determined look in her eyes. She carried herself with calm confidence, not the nervous glances that most people had when they saw him. She ordered her coffee and sat a few tables away, pulling out some papers from her bag. She didn't even notice him at first, and when she finally did, she didn't look away. That small act, meeting his eyes without fear, was enough to annoy him. He frowned. He was used to respect, to lowered heads, to people avoiding his gaze. But she just sipped her coffee and went back to her work as though his badge meant nothing. When the waiter brought his food, he noticed something. The woman had been waiting longer, but her order still hadn't come. The officer smirked. This was how things worked in his world, his needs first, everyone else second. He glanced at her, expecting a sigh or a look of defeat. Instead, she raised her hand and called the waiter politely. "Excuse me, I've been waiting for a while," she said. Her tone wasn't aggressive, but it was firm. The waiter stammered an apology, explaining that the officer's order had been rushed first. She looked straight at the officer, then, her eyes calm but sharp. "So my time doesn't matter because he wears a badge." The room went quiet. People froze, their eyes darting between her and the officer. No one ever spoke like that. No one ever dared. The officer leaned forward, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Do you know who I am?" She didn't flinch. "Yes. And do you know who I am?" The question caught him off guard. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. She continued, her voice steady. "I'm a citizen with rights. That badge doesn't give you the right to treat others like they're invisible." Gasps filled the cafe. No one had ever spoken to him like this, not in public, not with such confidence. His pride burned. He stood up slowly, towering over her table, his badge catching the light. "Careful," he said, his voice low but threatening. "You're walking on dangerous ground." But she didn't move. She looked up at him calmly and said, "The only dangerous ground is believing you're above the law." The room was thick with tension. The waiter trembled, unsure what to do. Customers held their breath, afraid of what would happen next. The officer's hands clenched at his sides, anger boiling in his chest. No one had ever challenged him so directly. But instead of shouting, she calmly packed her papers, stood, and said, "We'll finish this in court." Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that silenced even his anger. She walked out, leaving him fuming. His pride shattered in front of everyone. From that moment, she was no longer just another face in the crowd. She had become a threat, the first person to openly defy him without fear, and he couldn't let it go. His pride demanded revenge. He convinced himself that dragging her into court would be easy, that his badge would protect him as it always had. What he didn't realize was that by choosing her, he had chosen the wrong target. Unlike the others he had silenced, she had the knowledge, the courage, and the will to fight. She wasn't afraid of his badge. She was ready to expose everything it had been hiding. The cafe would be remembered as the place where the balance shifted, the moment when the officer's illusion of invincibility cracked. And though he didn't know it yet, his downfall had already begun. The cafe incident spread quickly through the town. People whispered about it with both shock and admiration. No one had ever spoken to him like that, not in public, not with such calm courage. For the first time, the officer felt his authority questioned. His pride burned every time he replayed her words in his head. The only dangerous ground is believing you're above the law. He couldn't let it go. His badge, his reputation, his illusion of invincibility, all of it felt threatened by one woman who dared to stand tall. To him, she was not just a critic. She was a challenge. And in his world, challenges had to be crushed, so he began planning. He told himself it wasn't about revenge. It was about discipline, about putting her in her place. He decided the courtroom would be his stage. After all, he had connections, influence, and a uniform that commanded respect. Judges had nodded at him before. Lawyers had shaken his hand, and juries had trusted his word without question. He believed the system would always lean in his favor. He filed charges, twisting the truth to paint himself as the victim. He claimed she had disrespected his authority, disrupted public order, and even threatened him. His words dripped with exaggeration, but he was confident. He had written many such reports before, and they had always worked. Why would this time be any different? When the notice reached her, the townspeople expected her to panic. Most thought she would apologize, disappear quietly, or try to make peace. That was how everyone else had survived his wrath. But she was different. When she read the paper, she didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled faintly, as though this was exactly what she had been waiting for. In the weeks that followed, the officer walked proudly through town, bragging to anyone who would listen. "She won't last a day in court," he said. "By the time I'm done, she wished she never opened her mouth." His colleagues nodded, some out of agreement, others out of fear. Citizens shook their heads quietly, not daring to argue. But inside, many hoped she would win. They were tired of his arrogance, tired of his abuse. She was their chance, even if they didn't say it aloud. The day of the first hearing, the courtroom was packed. It wasn't just another case, it was a spectacle. Everyone wanted to see what would happen when the officer, the man who had ruled the town with fear, stood against the woman who refused to bow. He entered the courtroom with swagger. His uniform crisp, his badge polished until it gleamed under the lights. He smirked at her across the room, convinced the outcome was already written. She sat calmly at her table, her papers neatly organized, her face unreadable. She didn't glare at him, didn't frown, didn't show fear. That unnerved him more than he expected. The judge arrived, and the proceedings began. The officer's lawyer spoke first, painting him as a respected servant of the community who had been insulted and endangered. They used words like disrespect, threat, and disorderly conduct, trying to twist her calm defiance into something criminal. The officer nodded proudly, convinced the jury was already leaning his way. Then it was her turn. She stood with quiet confidence, her voice steady but strong. She didn't waste time with anger or accusations. Instead, she spoke of rights, of law, of fairness. She reminded the courtroom that a badge is meant to protect, not to intimidate. She presented witnesses, people who had seen the cafe incident, people who confirmed she had been calm while he had been aggressive. The officer shifted uncomfortably. He hadn't expected anyone to testify against him. For years, fear had kept people silent. But her courage had lit something inside them. Now, they found their voices. Piece by piece, she began to dismantle the story he had built. Every exaggeration in his report, every twist of truth, she countered with evidence and calm logic. She even presented documents of past complaints that had been quietly buried. Complaints against him from citizens too afraid to push further. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the pattern became clear. This was not the first time he had abused his authority. The officer's smirk faded. His lawyer whispered frantically, trying to adjust the strategy, but it was too late. The tide had shifted. The jury, who had once glanced at his badge with respect, now looked at him with suspicion. The judge's face grew tighter with every new revelation. And still, she stood steady, not once raising her voice. She didn't need to. Her truth was sharper than any threat by the end of the session. The officer realized something terrifying. For the first time in his career, the badge wasn't enough. His usual trick sphere, authority, intimidation were powerless here. In the courtroom, where evidence mattered more than arrogance, he was just another man facing consequences. The woman gathered her papers calmly when the session ended. As she walked past him, she paused just long enough to say quietly, "This is only the beginning." Her words sent a chill through him. He had thought dragging her to court would crush her spirit. Instead, it had given her the stage to expose him, and though he didn't admit it aloud, deep inside he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear, the second day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was even more crowded than before. News had spread across town. This wasn't just a legal dispute anymore. It was a battle between arrogance and courage. People filled the benches, whispering as they waited. Some came out of curiosity, others out of quiet hope. They wanted to see if the woman who stood up to the officer could really bring him down. The officer walked in first, his uniform pressed, his badge gleaming. He tried to carry the same confidence as before, but there was a stiffness in his steps now. The smirk he wore on the first day was gone, replaced by tight lips and restless eyes. He had underestimated her, and now he knew it. Still, he told himself the badge would save him. It always had. Then she entered. No uniform, no badge, no symbols of power. Only a folder of documents in her hands and calm determination in her stride. The crowd noticed the difference. He walked like a man clinging to authority. She walked like a woman who didn't need it. When the judge gave her the floor, she rose. The room grew silent. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried strength. "Your Honor, this case isn't about one argument in a cafe. It's about a pattern of abuse, intimidation, and misuse of authority." She placed her evidence on the table. One file at a time, each like a stone being laid on top of the officer's chest. Witness statements. Video footage from the cafe. Past complaints that had been ignored. Names of people who had suffered but stayed silent out of fear. The officer shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. His lawyer tried to object, but the judge waved it off. The evidence was too relevant, too strong to ignore. Then came the witnesses. Ordinary people from the town, shopkeepers, workers, even a retired teacher stood up one by one to share their stories. Their voices shook at first, but with each word, they grew braver. They spoke of how the officer had shouted at them, threatened them, humiliated them. One man said, "I paid a fine for something I didn't do because I knew if I argued he'd make my life miserable." A woman added, "I stopped going to certain places just to avoid him." The crowd murmured, heads nodding, eyes widening. These weren't just random complaints. They were proof of years of unchecked arrogance. And it was all coming to light because one woman had dared to speak first. The officer clenched his fists, his pride bleeding out with every testimony. For years, he had built his shield on silence. Now that silence was shattered. The very people he thought he had silenced forever were standing against him, their courage growing with every word. And through it all, the woman stood steady. She didn't attack him with insults. She didn't lose her temper. She simply presented the truth, piece by piece, like a puzzle coming together. She looked at the jury, at the judge, at the crowd, not with anger, but with calm conviction. "A badge is meant to serve the people," she said. "But when it becomes a tool to oppress them, it loses its meaning." Her words struck deeper than any evidence. They weren't just about him. They were about the very idea of power. The courtroom wasn't just judging an officer now. It was questioning the misuse of authority itself. By the time she finished, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. On the first day, people had walked in expecting her to be crushed. Now, they were leaning forward, inspired by her strength. They weren't just watching a case. They were watching justice slowly wake up. The officer's lawyer tried to regain control, attacking her credibility, suggesting she had exaggerated, but it was useless. Every objection only made her calmer, stronger. She answered with facts, with documents, with witnesses who confirmed her story. His defense looked weaker with every passing minute. Finally, she turned to face him directly. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were sharp. "You thought your badge made you untouchable," she said. "But today, it doesn't matter what you wear on your chest. What matters is the truth. And the truth is standing against you." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Everyone in the room felt it. The judge leaned back. The jury exchanged glances. And the officer looked away, his arrogance crumbling in plain sight. For the first time, the people in town saw something they had never seen before: the badge failing to protect him. His shield of fear was gone, replaced by exposure, vulnerability, and shame. The woman gathered her papers and sat down quietly. She didn't need applause, didn't need cheers. Her calm presence was enough. She had taken her stand, and in doing so, she had given others the strength to stand too. The officer, once untouchable, now sat like a man cornered. And though the trial wasn't over yet, everyone could feel the shift. His downfall had already begun. The officer sat at the defendant's table, his once confident shoulders now heavy, his jaw tight. The courtroom buzzed with low whispers, but he didn't hear them. His mind raced as he realized the woman's steady voice. The witnesses' trembling but truthful stories had done something he had never thought possible. They had cracked the armor he had built for decades, for years. He had lived behind his badge like it was a shield, protecting him from consequences. Every time someone complained, he silenced them with threats. Every time someone hesitated, he filled the silence with his authority. It had worked for so long that he believed it was permanent. But now, in front of a jury, a judge, and a room full of citizens, that shield was shattering. The first crack came when the woman presented documents of past complaints. At first, he thought they were just words, but then names and dates appeared. People the jury could recognize, situations too specific to be lies. One complaint was from a shop owner who said the officer took goods without paying. Another was from a young man who said he had been fined for no reason. Then came a chilling one from an elderly woman who claimed he had shouted at her until she cried. Each testimony was like a hammer against his armor. He glanced at the jury, hoping for sympathy, but instead he saw eyes filled with suspicion. They weren't nodding at him anymore. They were nodding at her. The second crack came from within his own ranks. One of his colleagues, a younger officer, was called to the stand. At first, he tried to protect him, answering questions vaguely. But under oath, and under the woman's calm, firm questioning, the truth slipped out. Yes, the young officer admitted quietly, he sometimes stretched the rules. We were told not to question him. The courtroom gasped. It was small, but it was enough. A fellow officer admitting his intimidation was real. The badge no longer looked like a symbol of trust, it looked like a mask hiding corruption. The third crack came from the judge himself. Throughout the trial, the officer had expected nods of approval, the usual signs of silent support he had always enjoyed. But the judge's expression grew tighter each day. When the officer's lawyer objected again and again, trying to block evidence, the judge's voice was sharp. Overruled. The truth will be heard. That was when the officer began to feel fear, not the fear of losing money or reputation, but the fear of losing the very foundation of his pride. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, pulling at his collar. Sweat gathering at his temples. Meanwhile, the woman grew stronger. With every crack in his defense, her presence grew taller, steadier. She spoke less now, but when she did, her words carried more weight than before. "Power without accountability is not power," she said at one point. "It is weakness hiding behind a uniform." The people in the courtroom leaned forward. Some nodded. Some whispered to each other. Everyone could feel the truth in her words. Outside the courtroom, the story spread like fire. Newspapers wrote headlines. "Officer faces heat in courtroom showdown." On social media, people shared their own stories anonymously, saying, "He did this to me, too." His once proud reputation was being dismantled piece by piece. Not just inside the court, but across the entire town. And then came the final crack, the one that broke him from the inside. During cross-examination, the woman asked him a simple question. "Why do you believe your badge makes you greater than the people you serve?" For the first time in years, he didn't have an answer. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The silence hung in the air like a heavy curtain. The jury stared. The judge leaned forward. The crowd held their breath. The man who had always had something to say, some threat to deliver, some excuse to make, stood speechless. His silence was louder than any confession. Everyone saw it. Everyone felt it. The badge wasn't protecting him anymore. He lowered his eyes to the table. And in that small gesture, everyone knew the invincible man was broken. The cracks in his armor were no longer cracks. They were gaping wounds. The shield he had carried for so long lay shattered at his feet. And the woman, standing tall in her truth, had been the one to break it. The final day of the trial arrived. The courthouse was packed, every bench filled, people even standing along the walls. This was no longer just another legal case, it had become the town's moment of truth. Everyone had come to see if justice would finally stand taller than arrogance. The officer walked in with his lawyer, his uniform still crisp, his badge still shining. But the shine no longer had meaning. He carried himself heavily, as though the weight of the trial had drained the confidence he once wore like armor. He avoided the crowd's eyes, something he had never done before. For the first time, he looked smaller. The woman entered moments later, her steps steady, her face calm. She wasn't dressed in power. She didn't need to be. Her quiet presence was enough to silence the whispers in the room. She had carried herself with dignity throughout the trial. And now she stood at the edge of victory. The judge called the court to order. The room fell still. Everyone's attention shifted to the jury, who had spent long hours reviewing every piece of evidence, every testimony, every contradiction in the officer's story. The air was thick, tense, and heavy with expectation. When the jury foreperson stood, the officer sat up straighter, gripping the edge of the table, as though trying to hold on to the last thread of hope. His lawyer whispered something to him, but his ears buzzed too loudly to hear. His whole life, his whole illusion of invincibility, now rested in the hands of 12 ordinary people he had once thought beneath him. The foreperson's voice rang out, steady and clear. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The words cracked through the courtroom like thunder. Gasps filled the air. Some people clasped their hands to their mouths, others nodded in relief. The officer's face drained of color. He shook his head slowly, as if refusing to believe what he had just heard. Guilty. The word echoed in his mind. Louder than the crowd, louder than the judge's gavel. The judge spoke next. His tone sharp and decisive. "This court finds that the badge you wore was used not to serve, but to intimidate. Authority without accountability is not protection, it is abuse. And abuse has no place under the law." The officer's hands trembled on the table. His lawyer touched his arm, but he pulled away. The badge on his chest suddenly felt heavy, like a weight he could no longer carry. The judge continued, You are hereby stripped of your position and your badge. You will face penalties decided under the law, including suspension of duty, loss of pension, and further sentencing to be carried out. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped, some whispered, but many clapped quietly, relief washing over faces that had carried fear for years. The townspeople had seen justice with their own eyes. Justice that had been denied for so long. The officer rose slowly to his feet, his body stiff, his eyes glassy. An official approached and extended a hand. For a moment, he resisted. The badge had been his life, his pride, his shield. But finally, with trembling fingers, he unclipped it from his chest. The sound of metal scraping against fabric was louder than any applause. He placed it in the official's palm, his hand shaking, his jaw tight, and in that moment, the man who once thought he was untouchable stood exposed, just another man without power. The uniform no longer made him special. The badge no longer protected him. Across the room, the woman watched quietly. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. Her victory wasn't about humiliating him, was about restoring dignity to everyone who had suffered under his abuse. She stood as a symbol, a reminder that courage, truth, and persistence could break even the strongest illusion of power. The officer looked at her once. His eyes filled with a mix of rage, shame, and disbelief. But she held his gaze calmly, unshaken. He looked away first. That small act told the whole story. The man who once forced everyone to bow had now bowed in silence. When the session ended, people rushed outside, whispering and sharing the news. Some even cried, not out of sadness, but out of relief. Years of fear had lifted in an instant. The cafe workers, the shopkeepers, the elderly woman. The parents who had once told their children to stay silent, all of them, now had a story of hope. The officer was led away, his head lowered. His footsteps, once heavy with pride, now sounded hollow against the courthouse floor. The sound followed him like an echo of everything he had lost. The verdict was more than a punishment. It was a turning point. The courtroom had declared what everyone needed to hear. A badge is not a shield for arrogance. Power misused is power destroyed. And as he disappeared through the doors, stripped of everything he once held sacred, the woman remained standing, her quiet strength filling the room. She hadn't just won a case, she had given the town back its voice. Asterisk when the officer was escorted out of the courtroom. The sound of the heavy wooden doors shutting behind him echoed like the final note of a song that had played for far too long. For years, his presence had cast a shadow over the town. His badge had been a symbol of fear rather than respect. But that day, the shadow lifted. The people slowly left the courtroom, whispering to one another. Some still couldn't believe it. "He's really gone," one woman murmured. "I never thought I'd see the day." Others smiled faintly, their faces lighter, as though a burden had been lifted from their shoulders. It was not just about one man losing his badge. It was about the community realizing they were no longer powerless. The woman who had stood against him walked out quietly. She didn't celebrate or boast. She wasn't interested in victory for herself. Her goal had always been bigger. She had wanted justice. She had wanted to prove that courage mattered more than fear, that truth mattered more than intimidation. In her calm silence, there was a strength louder than any applause. People began approaching her outside the courthouse. A shopkeeper who once suffered under the officer's bullying shook her hand, his eyes wet with gratitude. "You gave us our voices back," he said softly. A young man whispered, "I thought no one could stop him." "You showed me we were wrong." Even the elderly woman who had once been shouted into tears by the officer embraced her, her frail arms carrying more emotion than words could. The woman smiled kindly at them, but she didn't take their praise as her own. "You all stood with me," she said. "I just lit the first candle. The rest of you kept it burning. Meanwhile, inside the holding area, the officer sat on a bench, staring at his empty chest where his badge had been. His mind raced back to the days when people moved aside for him, when doors opened, when silence followed his every command. He thought about the cafe, about the look in her eyes when she told him the law stood above him. For the first time, he realized what he had lost wasn't just a piece of metal. It was the respect he had thrown away, the dignity he had traded for arrogance. And dignity, once gone, could never be bought back. He thought the badge made him invincible. But now, stripped of it, he saw the truth: he was just a man, and a broken one at that. In the weeks that followed, the story spread far beyond the town. Newspapers covered it as a symbol of accountability. Articles were written about the dangers of unchecked power and the courage it takes to stand up against it. Social media turned the woman into an emblem of justice. People sharing her story with captions like, "One voice can break silence. One act of courage can change everything." The town itself began to heal. For the first time in years, citizens felt safe to speak out, to demand fairness, to believe that the law truly protected them. Other officers, once trapped under the shadow of his arrogance, began to serve with renewed honesty, knowing the world was watching. The courtroom verdict had not just punished one man, it had reshaped the meaning of the badge for everyone. The lesson was clear, and it echoed everywhere. A badge does not make you invincible. Respect does. Justice does. Truth does. Without those, a badge is nothing more than metal. For the woman, life went back to quiet normalcy, though people never forgot her courage. She never claimed to be a hero, never sought fame, but she remained a reminder that arrogance can fall, and dignity can rise in its place. For the officer, the fall was permanent. He faded into obscurity, remembered not for his years of service, but for the arrogance that destroyed him. His name became a cautionary tale told to young recruits: do not wear the badge like a crown. Wear it like a duty. And for the town, the memory lived on as both warning and inspiration. They had seen fear silenced, power humbled, and justice rise. They had seen that even the loudest arrogance could be destroyed by the quiet strength of one determined voice. The lesson of that day was written, not just in court records, but in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. No one is above the law. Not even those who think their badge makes them untouchable.